there really were two starting points for us, Sarah and I, for thinking about this conference. And the first one was a problem, and then an idea for a solution. And Sarah Feinstein and I are researchers here at Manchester. We're looking at cultural practices in Northern Ireland, including the different ways that culture and conflict have become interlinked. And we increasingly found ourselves encountering the same problem, and that was that many of the people we were approaching for interviews had been interviewed before, and not just once, but actually many times. And more often than not, they were being interviewed around issues relating to conflict. So we were saying, are we in danger of talking to the same people over and over again in the same organisations? And with our emphasis on understanding the region through studies of community, conflict and cultural difference, might we be overlooking what, actually I read something you said, Chris, what you described as the general and largely unexceptional experience of living and working in Northern Ireland. And what about the researched community? Is Northern Ireland suffering from research fatigue? And in what ways are the subjects of research invited to respond to research findings once we've researched them? What happens then? And what does all this mean in terms of the quality of the research and the impact that we're having on the communities we're researching? Were we approaching Northern Ireland as a laboratory for dissecting the causes and remedies of violent conflict? And we got really excited about this, because we thought, of course, that we were the only people that ever thought that. And then, of course, inevitably, we discovered that we hadn't hit on anything new at all. And, of course, 25 years ago, the late John Whyte had observed that relative to its size, Northern Ireland is possibly the most heavily researched area on Earth. Hundreds of books and thousands of articles have been published, he said, since the current troubles began there in 1968. And he wrote that in 1990. And more recently, of course, we became aware of all the interesting academic voices that have been challenging the idea of Northern Ireland as a place apart. Others locating the North in broader international and UK contexts, looking at the North as a way of throwing light on problems in the wider world. And many others, researchers and artists, who are simply working in Ireland's northern and border counties because, well, that's where they're from, or, it's become their home, or it's the place where their intellectual or artistic interests reside. So we're delighted to welcome some of these people here today to take part in our conversation. And that really brings me to the second idea that's underlying today's conference, and that is the idea of forming a research network, a network that could act as a platform for discussing ideas of common interest, presenting papers, testing research ideas, and building links that could bear fruit in future projects. And we're hoping that some of these questions that are raised today will provide a starting point for exploring future possibilities, for bringing together early career researchers like ourselves with established scholars alongside activists, professionals, and other informed and interested representatives from researched communities, and also very much including the public at large. So we're starting this off today with a panel discussion, Northern Ireland, over-researched and misunderstood. And that's going to be followed by a presentation by Sean Hewitt, who is a co-founder of the Liverpool Postgraduate Journal of Irish Studies. And then after lunch, we're screening a film, which is the English premiere of a new film, You Were Never Big on Luxuries, Art, Life and Conflict. The director, Lawrence McEwen, is actually speaking on the panel this morning, and he's going to talk about the film with Alison Jeffries in a question and answer after lunch. So let me just introduce now very briefly our four panellists. I'm going to introduce them in the order they're going to speak. We asked them to put together a 10-minute take on the question, Northern Ireland, over-researched and misunderstood. And that should leave us with 30 to 40 minutes for a conversation with everyone here in the room. So I'll keep the introductions brief because there are larger biographies on the schedule that we handed out. So I'll just keep them brief. In the order they're going to speak. Chris Gilligan, and Chris, on my right here, is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of the West of Scotland. And his main field of research is in the broad area of nationalism, racism, sectarianism and migration. And he's published widely on understanding the peace process in Northern Ireland and also the politics of immigration. And next up is, on my left, Sheelagh Colclough, who is a Belfast-based artist working in collaborative arts practice, arts engagement, education, production, programming and research. And she was part of the outreach team for the Turner Prize 2013 in Derry, Londonderry, UK City of Culture, and she's also exhibited with Golden Thread Gallery in Belfast, and she's going to be artist in residence with Izoliatia in could be check that one out with Sheelagh, she'll tell you, in the Ukraine in July this year. Great.
I've been calling them
Izzo, they're called Izzo. And next up will be Roger McGinty, who's down on the far left of the table here, and he is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute and the Department of Politics here in the University of Manchester, where he teaches on the Peace and Conflict Studies MA programme. He also edits the journal Peace Building, or co-edits the journal Peace Building, and is currently working on everyday indicators of peace and insecurity in 4 sub-Saharan countries and on a project on the data collection by UN peacekeepers. And the fourth speaker will be Lawrence McEwen, who's a writer, a playwright and a filmmaker whose involvement in creative works, political education and academia began during his period of incarceration as a political prisoner between 1976 and 1992. And Lawrence completed a doctoral thesis at Queen's, which examined the development of Irish Republican prisoners, politics and methods of organisation, and in the 1990s co-wrote a feature film based on the 1981 hunger strike. And there'll be more on Lawrence's career as a playwright and filmmaker this afternoon, and you'll hear more about that when he's talking to Alison. So we should leave that hanging there, and let's start off the debate then. Chris, do you want to go off? 10 minutes.
Well, thanks to Pauline and to Sarah for inviting me along here today. I'll try and keep to 10 minutes. The difficulty for me has been how to just pick and choose a few things and make them very pertinent to the topic, because I could probably use the full hour and a half to talk about this, left to my own devices, or some people might say ramble on for an hour and a half. Northern Ireland is over-researched and misunderstood. As Pauline points out, John Whyte made the claim that Northern Ireland is probably the most researched place on earth in 1990. In 1990 he made that claim per square mile, and it's quite possibly was true then. From some of the things that people have been telling me over the last few days, from what Pauline's just saying, it's quite possibly still true in Northern Ireland. I think there's some pragmatic reasons behind that. One is that it's relatively easy to fly in and out of Belfast from anywhere in the world, so that's one thing. Another thing is that it's an English-speaking part of the world, and most of the academics that are funded in the world today are based in English-speaking universities, so there's things there that make it a bit easier. But there's also the relatively low level of conflict in Northern Ireland. You know, if Carlsberg were going to do wars, they'd do Iraq and the Gulf War, or they'd do Rwanda. They wouldn't have done Northern Ireland. So it's a relatively low level conflict, which means that you can go there and do the research and find out things about conflict and about war without exposing yourself too much The protagonists who were involved, for them it was dangerous, but for most of us growing up in Northern Ireland, it didn't feel like a particularly dangerous place. I mean, part of that's about when you grow up, you get used to it, you know, okay, if I'm going to go over this part of Belfast, I need to be able to sing the sash. If I go over this part of Belfast, I need to be able to sing the soldier's song, or you have to remember which way you're supposed to say H or H and things like that. But by and large, you knew where things were. And for lots of people who come and visit Northern Ireland, even during the Troubles, they were surprised that outside of Belfast, which was quite militarised, you go up on the north coast and it felt like, what? How can there be a war here? So there's that. So the most researched, but also the misunderstood bit. So M.L.R. Smith talks about the intellectual internment of Northern Ireland, the way in which Northern Ireland is treated as a case in its own terms, as a place apart, or Northern Irish exceptionalism. And he talks about his own discipline of international relations as lacking in intellectual curiosity, that there's the already given template of how you understand conflict, and you go to Northern Ireland and you see what fits in and what doesn't fit in, rather than an intellectual curiosity of saying, right, well, what is going on here? There's various different ways in which that's manifested, I think, that lack of intellectual curiosity. And then there's also Robbie McVeigh, who talks about sectarianism as being under-theorised. The conflict in the media was often presented as being about sectarianism, so you would expect lots of people have looked into this, investigated, but actually there's very, very little that's written on, theoretically, on what is sectarianism. Quite aside from debates about whether the conflict was sectarian or was not sectarian. I think in relation to any kind of research, there's a tension between the researcher, on the one hand, the funder of the research, on the other hand, and those that are being researched. There's always a tension there. There was a tension there during the conflict, so you'll find that a lot of the research, as Whyte also points out, fits within an internal conflict interpretation. By and large, that's because that's the way in which the British government and the government of the Republic of Ireland are presenting the conflict in Northern Ireland, that it's something that's contained to Northern Ireland, it's about what's happening in Northern Ireland. But that's a construction of the conflict. That is a political strategy to say, this is what the conflict is about. It's about Northern Ireland, it's not really outside of that. And most of the research, unsurprisingly, fits into that. In the context of a conflict, a lot of the research fitted into taking sides, right? Looking at republicanism or being sympathetic to republicanism, but that was a minority. The vast majority was more looking at the side of the British state, or how do we have bring about conflict resolution or create peace in Northern Ireland, which wasn't conceived in terms of create a united Ireland or withdraw the British troops or anything like that. So there's always ways in which the conflict is conceptualized that influences the way that people then look at it. With the peace process, a lot of that's changed. Right? Where the priorities now are is keeping the peace process going, maintaining. That's where the political priorities are. That's where the funding priorities are. Lots of people got funded through things like peace money, directly through peace money to do research. I can say I've taken the King's shilling, or should it be the euro or the cent for having done that. I think probably anyone who's done in recent years research on Northern Ireland, that's where the funding has come from, or a significant amount of it's come from. I think there's also something else that mediates that relationship between researcher, funder, and the researched. The notion of what the future should be, or what the purpose of research is for. Why are you doing this? What is it that's wrong with society that you want to investigate or understand in order to change it? During the conflict, there was a notion of a united Ireland. That's what the future is. That the future has to be very different from what it is today. Whereas today, an idea of what the future should be is like it is today, but with people being a little bit better off, rather than anything fundamentally different, which does shape the way that we look at and understand the conflict. And another element, I think, is the agency of those who are the research subjects, or the people who live in society. And during the conflict, there were people actively involved in on the side of the state and resisting the state in Northern Ireland. Whereas the peace process is in part itself built on a disengagement from, and further promotes a disengagement from politics and from political life, which does raise questions and issues for us as researchers about what are we actually researching. I find myself that when I look at things that are being written on Northern Ireland, increasingly it seems to be out of touch with reality. The difficulty I have is I'm not quite sure what reality is anymore in Northern Ireland, and trying to get a handle on that is something I think is difficult. Just finally, I have to say this. I feel like I have to say this because it feels very real and very present. And one of the things I think that's really undermining a lot of research, and not specifically in Northern Ireland, but it's true of research on Northern Ireland, is the demands of UK academia in terms of the ref, in terms of impact. That promotes a lack of intellectual curiosity. Those two drivers promote something different. There's a much more instrumentalist approach towards knowledge that's being promoted by British government funding of research, which is true also of a whole lot of the charities. I know of people who've done work for Oxfam, the Joseph Rowntree Trust, maybe I shouldn't name any specific funders, who've produced work and been told that's not really what we were looking for, and it doesn't get published, whereas other stuff does get published because it fits with the agenda of those organisations. So it's not just the UK government, but UK government is a significantly big funder. And I think one of the problems is that kind of funding of research actually exacerbates the problem of trying to understand what's going on in society, because the whole impact agenda isn't about making an impact in society. It's about making an impact amongst those people that it's measurable with. Right? Is it in the media? Is it do you have people from the key NGOs or the government departments talking about this? And in a way, we get even further out of touch with what's happening on the ground. So that tension between the researcher, the funder, and the research is always there. But the way in which it's articulated, the kinds of problems that we encounter, I think has changed considerably over the years. And I would say not for the better. Probably for the worse in lots of ways, in terms of actually trying to understand and change society, which is why I got involved in doing research in the first place, not because I wanted to have a doctorate, or, not because I wanted to be an academic, although you can never separate those two things. I still want to have a job, but the thing that was driving me wasn't I want to be an academic. The thing that was driving me was I want to understand what's going on in the world, and being a little idealist, I wanted to actually try and be part of changing that as well. And looking at the world today, I'm pessimistic, except the elections recently. To me, there's some hope, there's some optimism there, or some basis for optimism. I was really interested in the way that People Before Profit topped the poll in West Belfast. Not got a candidate, but topped the poll in West Belfast, which had been Sinn Féin stronghold, and frustrated Sinn Féin's efforts to take an extra seat in Foyle, where Eamon McCann, after all of his years of trying to be elected, finally became elected and showed that it is possible. And to me, there's something that's changing there. Whether that's going to be able to transcend and they would be able to get seats in East Belfast or not, but that's to be able to do what they want to do, of break out of the sectarian politics. That's what they will have to do ultimately if they want to succeed in that. But to me, there's signs of hope there.
Oh.
Okay, thank you.
Dead on time, brilliant, thanks. I was saying 1 minute then, but yeah, brilliant, thanks Chris. Okay, Sheelagh, your take.
Okay, well, I'm not going to stand up, and I'm also going to read out loud, partly because I'm too lazy to stand up for 10 minutes, and partly there is no mission of me being able to stick to 10 minutes unless I don't stick to my script. So
I'll
you
make
know.
sure you do.
So I feel a little bit like an interloper on this panel. So I'm going to just justify to myself for a small paragraph a little bit about my background. So over time and through my profligate range of roles in the arts in Northern Ireland, my practice has sort of gradually mutated and given birth to the Sheelagh Foundation, which is an entirely conceptual organisation. It exists in my mind a bit shamefully online. I have a bit of a CMS issue at the minute. And in your mind, if you choose to believe, it's a bit like a cross between Santa and the A-Team. So I describe it as a for-profit artist collective of one. And it came from my growing awareness that the disparate groups involved in participatory arts work in Northern Ireland seem to have a very different understanding and agenda about what they were engaged in and why. And I wanted a robust pretend mechanism to explore that. So, apart that, I feel that within my discipline and academia, at least in academia, there are ethics committees and guidelines for conduct. Even in really poorly thought out research, there is a semblance of acknowledging power, structures, and inherent biases. However, in community arts, participatory arts, socially engaged arts, collaborative arts, or whatever we're going to call it these days, there is just good and bad practice, or artists or arts organisations, and an awful lot of evaluation reports. Again, I have taken the King's Euro shilling and been part of a lot of them, but hopefully I've saved them from the depths of mediocrity a little bit. Who gets to decide on how successful, useful, or even necessary a participatory arts project is a really dark art. From the design and methodology of feedback and data collection to the originators of the reports and their audiences and the purpose of those reports, which I would attest is essentially to make sure the cycle continues. So I think there's quite a lot of overlap with what Chris is saying. Community arts, as recognised as a grassroots movement emerging from civil rights struggles worldwide, especially in Northern Ireland, does have core principles, those being ownership, authorship, access and participation. But the general awareness and the democratic application of those principles, in my experience, is generally rare among participant groups in community arts sector. There are notable exceptions, and many of those are within community theatre. In my experience, caveats all round. So I would agree with the general view that Northern Ireland, the research community, is much like the participatory arts community and being done a great disservice by being largely done to rather than even done with, or the exceptionally rare done by. I have met some communities that seem truly self-actualised and wholly invested in projects, but after 30 years of this practice, there seem to be relatively few truly community-run arts groups or even commensurate attitudinal change, employability, educational attainment, social mobility, health and well-being increases, etc., etc., etc. All the tropes that these projects have foisted upon them and even more worryingly sign up to. What I definitely have seen in 15 years of my practice within this sector are some shifts and changes, but nothing like the evaluation reports would lead you to believe. It's almost like these problems are more complex or something. So here's a quote, quite a long quote, so stay with me, from a piece of work that I did a few years ago called Reevaluate. And this is Francois Materasso responding to a question that I posed to him. So here we go. Yeah, too much is asked of community arts. Much too much is asked of art, full stop. Paradoxically, having said how fundamental I think it is, I think it's also fundamental that largely you can't control what happens in artistic experiences, and therefore to approach it as a kind of remedial prescription is a very foolish thing to do, because you can't control what its consequences will be, and therefore the most useful thing you can try to do is accept that you can't control it and not try. If you do try to control it, you're just going to end up, at best, failing to do what you're trying to do, and at worst, producing all kinds of perverse or unanticipated results. I do think too much is expected, and that's partly because we have moved from a society that dealt with puzzles to a society that is faced with problems. The difference between the two is that a puzzle is something that has a solution. You know it has a solution, but you might not know what the solution is. For instance, if in Belfast in the 19th century you have a puzzle of infant mortality, then the solution, or one of the solutions, is improved sanitation. A lot of what we've done in Western societies in the 100 years between 1850 and 1950 is to solve very effectively a whole set of puzzles. Public health puzzles, housing puzzles, transport puzzles, and what we're left with now is a set of problems, and problems don't have solutions. Problems are things that there may not even be solutions to. You certainly don't know what they are, and they're more to do with how do you reduce teenage pregnancy? How do you deal with obesity? That's a complicated issue, and there may be all kinds of factors, and things often happen for very indirect reasons. Karl Popper back in the 1940s talked about the unintended consequences of policy, and most of public policy has all kinds of unintended consequences, but politicians largely ignore that or pretend it's not the case. So I think one of the reasons that politicians ask too much of art now is because they're faced with a whole bunch of problems they don't know how to solve, so they're kind of flailing about for pretty much anything that looks as if it'll do some good. Here endeth the lesson. So, as a kind of contrapoint to everything I've just said, I'm going to talk about an arts research project I was involved in recently. Beat Carnival, who are a Belfast-based carnival arts organisation, have had premises at the bottom of the Shankill for a few years after having moved across town. They set out to conduct an arts mapping project of the area and produce and present a written and visual report to a community-run consortium. They wanted to find out what kinds of art activity local people might be interested in participating in order to better guide their programming and increase their profile in the area. The project was in response to their own and local communities' leaders' desires not simply to respond to funding, but to shape it and build meaningful, lasting relationships in their immediate area. So after listening to me talk this long, you appreciate that this kind of approach is still quite rare in the sector. So I and another artist, Sally Young, who does a lot of work in and around the Shankill, which, in case anybody doesn't know, which I'm sure you do, is what might be termed a classically post-conflict area of multiple deprivation in the charming government parlance. We went along to Hemsworth Court in the Lower Shankill, which is a supported housing scheme for people with dementia. Hemsworth Court are the poster children, quite old children, but still the poster children of community arts. I think you would struggle to find a more involved, self-actualised, active and generally confident group. They are currently engaged in about 26 regular arts classes and projects, from poetry to plant bombing, in their centre and all over Belfast. In their own words, it's important to do things to keep active. It's better to wear away than rust away. So they are wearing away quite nicely. When we asked them about the best ways to engage local people, they were full of ideas. Significantly, when we asked about the hard-to-reach groups, another funding term I despise, and about whether sending artists or a group like them would work best, they categorically stated that they thought a group like them would be more effective in establishing trust and creating a lasting sense of community through the greater likelihood of sustained and tailored activity. This leads me to another point. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but I think this work, research and arts projects, the means of civic participation is far too atomized. The studied or worked with are not another tribe. They are us, and I think we need to address our weird Victorian approach of helping the disadvantaged that we can't seem to successfully shake off. By the way, helping the disadvantaged is a direct quote from a foundation who funded part of the project I just talked about. There is an awfully fine line between artists and the disadvantaged. So I'm going to end with a quote. It's not as long, but it is from Theaster Gates speaking in an Art Forum article from March 2016. My future of art is different from what art is today. When I build my school, I'm going to teach people that whatever is taught at the MFA level is akin to elementary school. In elementary school, students will learn replica, mise-en-scene, and representation. In middle school, they will learn about reflexivity, reproducibility, reaction, and reflection. In high school, students will learn to see the invisible, to understand the philosophies of the individual, will learn physics and religion. As undergraduates, my future pupils will learn transgression, systems of power, how to be a system of power, and how to harness systems of power. They will learn to mine for gold, dig for diamonds. They will learn how to fish. In graduate school, students will learn how to levitate. Until we're willing to think about the complexities, until we're willing to think about the human capacity to understand complex symbols and thought forms and the the invisible, we will think that murals alone can solve social problems. I would never make a mural to solve a social problem. It takes money to solve social problems. It takes hard conversations and political power. Artists should also sculpt those things.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Roger.
I'm going to use PowerPoint. Great, thank you, and thank you very much to Sarah and Pauline for organising this. I think to organise an event that has coffee and muffins in the morning is immediately a success in my book. I could sum up my 10-minute presentation in 3 words, which is what Chris said. Because the parallels between what I had thought I was going to say and what Chris was going to say would make me suggest that he is particularly good at telepathy. The parallels are spooky. So the question is, Northern Ireland over-researched and misunderstood? My answer, probably. But so what? People are big enough and ugly enough to tell researchers to go away. And there are a lot of good reasons why Northern Ireland is a good place for research. Chris mentioned very many of them. Scale, it's a small place, it's English speaking. Although the food is terrible, it's unlikely that you're going to get Delhi belly. A lot of people from this part of the world don't need a visa to get there. But there are other reasons as well. We live in an era of increasingly risk-averse neoliberal universities, in which, for example, in Manchester, the ethics form has 53 questions. It's a week's work to fill in. We've got a ridiculous situation where students from Columbia are denied permission by the university to go back to Columbia to conduct field research. So in the context of neoliberal risk-averse universities, Northern Ireland actually is quite a good place to do responsible, conflict-sensitive research. And I fear that we are moving slowly towards a post-fieldwork era for a lot of researchers in my field, simply because the institutional barriers that are being created to conduct research are too great. So Northern Ireland is in a sense, an easy case. And I think that certainly I am content with my research students going there rather than going to some other places where they have to check in with me daily because of kidnap risk or whatever. But on thinking more generally about Northern Ireland and academia, I have a wider critique, and it overlaps with many of the things that Chris said. I think the fundamental problem with a lot of academia in Northern Ireland is that on Northern Ireland and in Northern Ireland is that it is introspective. It's navel-gazing. And I Google imaged navel-gazing, and that's what I got. That's clever, isn't it? Imprints of navels. And again, along the lines of what Chris said, this is the quotation from MLR Smith in which he's talking about my discipline, international relations. And he says that international relations scholars and analysts of the Northern Ireland crisis have passed each other like ships in the night, wending their respective ways, one barely cognizant of the other, with no, or at least very minimal, cross-fertilization of ideas. And to be candid, there is an intellectual internment, a self-imposed internment by many academics on and in Northern Ireland. I struggle to think of academics on the subject who have made contributions in terms of theory building and concept building, who have, in a sense, engaged in the critical thinking that defines disciplines. They've produced a lot of data and material that is Northern Ireland specific, but often that's where it stays. And I struggle to think of the big names working in or on Northern Ireland who contribute outwards to the big debates within sociology, within international relations, within geography, within whatever other ones I haven't mentioned. There is obsession with the exceptionalism of Northern Ireland. Many people I refer to Northern Ireland as having some sort of psychosis of believing that it is populated by the mopes, the most oppressed people ever. It's not. Again, very much what Chris said. Yes, I'm not underestimating the impact of the conflict on individuals, families, communities. It is a deeply dysfunctional society, but this ain't Syria, and it never was. And yet there is no embarrassment amongst scholars, practitioners, in using the term Northern Ireland in relation to, in the same sentence as Syria. I brought a small group of students around Northern Ireland some years ago, and we met the political parties. The group included 3 Afghans, someone from Sri Lanka, someone from Georgia. Not once did any of the self-important politicians ask the students any questions. It was bizarre. They thought that Northern Ireland was ground zero. Now, another critique of academia and Northern Ireland is I don't think it has any impact. I don't think it has much impact outside of publications in unread journals. Remember, this is still a deeply divided society. 78% of people who voted last Thursday voted for the 4 main politico-sectarian parties. 95% of kids still go to segregated schools. So what I'm saying is there is an urgent need for academia to play its part, just as citizens, professional associations, civil society has to do its part as well. Fundamentally, after the Good Friday Agreement, there has not been reconciliation. There's been no push from politicians for reconciliation. Look at the legislative record on that. It is, quite frankly, a disgrace, because sectarian parties do not want to legislate themselves out of business. Therefore, there is no serious reconciliation policy. The big danger is that research has been co-opted into the status quo. Again, what Chris said. So there are lots of reports, lots of journal articles, lots of evaluations. But the 2 universities in Northern Ireland are just like universities here. They're peopled by grant hunters, by very often people obsessed, because they're forced to be obsessed with the ref, with very superficial forms of impact, which are all about reinforcing policy decisions that have already been made. They're not, and thus critical blue skies thinking is often discouraged. There was a fantastic blog piece by Anthony McIntyre and Mark Hayes. It's part of a much wider piece on the fallout of the Boston College tapes. And the quotation, the wider piece, is simply 2 barrels of a shotgun gone off in your face. It really is a no-holds-barred, fantastic blog piece. And they say, in the midst of this blog piece, there's a much broader issue of the role of the ESRC, which is the biggest social science funder in the UK, which allocates its funding on the basis of impact assessments and the research excellence framework, which channels academics into producing research which has a viable outcome in terms of public policy. Independent, critical research is thereby relegated and denigrated as the focus is placed on useful projects that are designed to help government departments. The logical consequence of this obsequious deference to power is not only a stultifying functionalism in academic circles, occasionally it leads to the obscenity of noteworthy academics offering, in effect, to work for the security services of a particular state. They're talking about a particular project and a controversy linked to that. But the wider point holds about, quite frankly, the lack of impact that academia has had. And I'm not absolving myself in any way from this. This is very much a self-critique. Right. There's a danger, I think, with academia, and again, I'm in no way excluded from this, that we are caught up in our own conceit, that we like hearing ourselves talk. And I'm particularly thinking about what's often referred to as memory work around commemoration, work around memorialisation of the Troubles. My wife, who is not an academic and keeps me grounded, actually keeps me floored, would be more accurate. She's also from Northern Ireland, calls it picking the scab. And I actually agree with her in many respects about this picking the scab. And I wonder, who is it for? Is it for the academic or is it for the people? Because it strikes me that the real commemoration, the real coming to terms with grief, doesn't happen in workshops. It doesn't happen in conferences. It doesn't happen in evaluation reports. It happens around the kitchen table. It happens at the sink when you think of your loved one, that they used to do the dishes or they used to stand there. And I think, in a way, we have to be brutally honest in relation to a lot of academia. It's about us. It's an indulgence. It risks being a conceit. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as long as we're honest. And my difficulty is with the academics who say, oh, I'm working on Northern Ireland or I'm working on the Troubles, and they lower their voice and they put their head to one side for empathy. And I think, listen, mate, you drive a desk for a living. You have a very comfortable life, and we need to be very honest about that and think about our own social responsibility as academics. Thank you.
Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Pauline and Sarah, for the invite to come over here, and and all the hospitality. Whenever I was contacted by Pauline, she says you can do a 10-minute presentation or provocation, which is the first time I'd heard that term used, and I thought, well, Irish Republicans are often accused of causing provocation, so I mean, you're actually invited to do it. So. I don't really work in academia, and I'm interested to take up this point that just Roger has finished on here. Yesterday morning I was speaking at an event in Queen's University. It was about Palestinians and Irish Republicans about hunger strikes, which I took part in, so I've written about it. But beyond the discussion, one of the breaks about the Eames Bradley attempt to find some way to deal with the past. One of the really significant things that they come up with was that whenever they approached certain organisations, such as academia, they were at a loss to say, oh yes, we'll help you in your process, and they're saying, no, we don't want you to help you, we want to put you on the spotlight. What did you do during the conflict? And the similarity with churches, and I think some of them quite angry and resentful that they would be accused of having had any part or parcel in the conflict. I actually think it did have, I think by omission, when I think back to like the academics in the North who wrote about, and I'm speaking as an Irish Republican, the prisons, internment, strip searches, interrogation, diplomatic courts, shoot to kill policies, I can count in one hand. And their careers suffered, as would, and anybody who did put their head above the parapet was a fellow traveller, provo lover, whatever else. So I think when we're looking at research and academia and all the rest of it, it's not to lay blame on people. There's the realities, they live in the place, the families, if they want to advance. So, I mean, will I say this or will I just keep quiet and sort of maybe get this sort of path along the way here? So I have no tendency in that, but it's just because I'd ended on academia in general, I think it should be part of it. I think we're talking about research. Certainly in the North. I mean, all I wanted to focus on very quickly, and I better keep an eye on time here because I'm you'll do it anyway. As I say, not working in academia, but having conducted research in different ways, or I would call it socially engaged research, or through the arts, trying to use it through plays and through film interviews to deal with some of those issues. So just look very quickly at, why is there that focus on the North? And some of that has already been answered, so apologies for going back over it. Who is the research for? What's the role of the researcher in that whole process? And what is the research meant to achieve? And I think if, again, we're looking at why is there a focus? People say because of conflict, but I mean, there's conflicts all over the world, as has already been mentioned, ongoing and have been ongoing in the past. So what's so specific that? Is it because it's Western Europe? And again, there's been conflicts in Western Europe. I was during a panel at the Belfast Film Festival the other week, which where numbers is that, where we had Ed Galimi, who's a correspondent with the Guardian newspaper, who's written extensively on the situation in the former Yugoslavia, particularly the camps of Srebrenica, and also Anthony Hockey, I've worked with as a photographic artist, who again has been very much involved over there, and he's done it's a brilliant piece. It's about 18 minutes a year. I get a chance to view it. It's called Unresolved, as in UN resolved, because it was part of the UN resolution. In the course of 5 days, over 8,000 Muslim men and youths were killed. That's twice as many as were ever killed in the North over the last 25 years. Now, not to reduce things to a head count, but why is there not the same sort of exploration? And maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there is that going on, but I don't see it. Is it because it's Christian? Very possibly. Western Europe and Christian, they're not supposed to do it, living in a so-called democratic society. White-skinned, probably very probably. And again, talking about the irony of things, I work as a playwright, a play I did, which Sarah would have seen, Those You Pass on the Street, which is written specifically as a 1-hour play that can then lead to discussion afterwards. It's going to South Africa. There's no self-promotion here. It's going to South Africa as part of an international arts festival, but around the whole commemoration of Soweto. It's also then going to Rwanda immediately after that as part of their commemoration around the genocide there. And in some sense, you get a bit embarrassed because, I mean, in Rwanda, on one day between breakfast and lunchtime, there was more people killed than have been killed in Ireland in the last 200 years out of all the conflicts. I mean, that's the scale, and it does lead to a bit of self-search. And why does that then get the prominence and other people don't? Is it, again, back that's Western Europe, white-skinned, and it's accessible, as Roger's already said. I mean, someone can jump on a plane, come over, I mean, it's English-speaking, so people who are researchers in Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland, US, Canada, I mean, so it's immediately accessible. Most people in Europe speak English, so send an email, do a phone call, arrange a few interviews, fly into Belfast. Maybe the grub's not so great, but you have a bit of crack in the pubs and such like, and you're back out again. And there's lots of other material available, and probably in a sense, people are willing to speak to you, and I know it's been talked here about research fatigue, but I do think people are, I think there's a welcome. I think people like to actually assist you, but they also do like to talk about their own situation as well. The other thing is does academia follow the media interest? A media that's now controlled increasingly by fewer and fewer people who decide what is the news today that you're going to hear, or what, more importantly, is the news that you're not going to hear. Does academia follow that there? And if it is, surely that raises major questions about its role of actually raising the other issues that maybe the media doesn't. Who's the research for? I've done dozens of interviews with people about jail and hunger strike and education and community development and all the rest of it. And I'm happy to do it because I also have gone to people looking for interviews and take up their time. So, and I'm interested in the pursuit of rights. I'm also interested in someone, like a younger person, asks a new question from a different angle that you've never thought of before. Because I had to be self-reflexive and think that, well, that's good. I never would have thought of that, and I find that increasingly, which is great. But largely, the research for the person who's doing it, the one person, they read it. Maybe their tutor reads it as well. Maybe there's a small panel, but beyond that, is anybody else ever going to read it? Maybe it gets published. Again, does it get published for a very select group of people who may read it? And then I say that's neither good nor bad. I see it if it gets done and they have got their job done and they can advance their career. Do the research ever really get the results? I don't think so. Do the research worry about ever getting the results? I don't think so. Are they interested in the results? Not really. Unless you've actually misquoted them, and then you better be prepared for it because they're coming after you. But then they've got to have seen it in the first place to see that. So I think when maybe, and maybe it's again, I think about the self-importance of academia, we could exalt things into research that's conducted and over so many years and so on and so forth. But really, at the end of the day, what did it add to our overall knowledge? The role of the researcher is something that's really interested me, and I suppose because of my own doctoral thesis, it was something that I struggled over because I was a former prisoner writing about the prison, so I had to write myself into the research, and actually I very much use feminist methodologies because they challenge the role of the researcher in this idea of objectivity versus subjectivity and how you almost have to look for the BBC type of balance, which I've encountered numerous times over the years. But looking at places, so I wrote my doctoral thesis with interviewing myself in a sense in it, and I struggled with it for ages because in my head, and even though I'd come through prison, even though we had developed our own political education programme, very much influenced by Paulo Freire, who we were talking about last night briefly, even then, when I went to Queen's to do it, there was still this thing of like, this is just a yarn that you're going to come out with, this isn't a piece of research or academia, this is like, the stories of people. And then I had to keep saying it, but yeah, that's what it is, it's a story of real people. And different people who had maybe different views about it's not everybody singing from the same hymn sheet, which sometimes people can think when they're looking on Ireland, that certain Republicans are all speak with one voice. I think behind that there's not a lot of discussion. So in that sense of placing myself into research and looking at it, and that's been something that I think is critical and something that has guided me in any of the smaller bits of research that I have done. But one in particular I just wanted to refer to was, or an example of it was gender at the interface, which was a piece of research I did a few years ago. And I was looking at gender, obviously, on the interface areas in Belfast. It was commissioned by a group called BCRC, Belfast Conflict Resolution Consortium. And basically they're made up of representatives of all the groups, IRA, UVF, UDA, whatever else. It's been a process over the years to try to stop rioting and trouble on the interface areas. Originally started with a mobile network phone that somebody could contact the others on each side to stop trouble before it actually flares up into something big. And I was really bemused at why this group was, because I know they're largely male dominated, was looking to look at gender, and of course it was the one woman who sits in the management who had seen that in the workshops there was young people and women attending them in large numbers, but it was the men who controlled things. So anyway, I got the tender to do this. I contacted a whole range of groups, loyalist areas, Republican areas. Some had already known me, both in the loyalist areas, certainly in the Republican areas. And I just said two things. One is, this is my background, this is where I'm coming from. I'm an Irish Republican, former political prisoner, and this is a research which I'm not going to do. The second thing is, I'm not going to do anything in this research which makes your situation worse than it has been already. And there may be people in academia who would challenge that, so we didn't come in with a very biased viewpoint. And yes, I don't think anybody does anything, certainly in PhDs, to spend 5 years or more, whatever else, if they're not passionate about the subject, if they don't have a certain politic to begin with. And okay, you have to show validity and all the rest of it, but you start out with a certain point of view. And to their credit, nobody had an issue with it at all. I was as welcome until unionist areas in the Shankill, Woodfield, Village, Sandy Row, East Belfast, as it was anywhere else. The report was done, and it sat for a year because the management didn't really like what was being said. And it was interesting also that someone who would, let's say, would be a bit more academically inclined. What I did in the report was really divide the comments into themes. and as largely as possible, the bulk of the whole report is the women's direct words of what they were saying, with other methodology and all put in it. But that was the focus of it. And someone said to me, and I was being polite about it, I think maybe Lawrence could have maybe drawn on a few other sources or something. I said, like what? Well, interface. And I said that actually looked at gender and said, well, maybe not, but maybe there's some of those writings here and that started to mention a few people. And I said, do you think the people that this was for would have then read it if that was in it? No, but they probably wouldn't. I said, well, then what is the purpose of the research? For me, the purpose was to record what people were saying on the ground about the men they were working with, or the paramilitary organisations, or the society, or the funding, or whatever it was. This was their chance to say it, and to say it, initially anonymously, to the people who were there, management, and that they could hear it, and they didn't like what they were hearing. But that was the purpose, the whole purpose of the research. And I suppose those are things for me just that I try to bear in mind of teaching, because to me that is the critical thing. Who is it for? Thankfully, the management and they did come around to change it. They did make then changes to the organisation. Women who had been there doing a lot of the work but not having the responsibility did start to move up on it. And to me, that's how it works now. Whether that's in the arts and using it, which I also try to do, is pose the questions. And okay, if someone does a piece of research and it just helps their career, moves them on, that's fine. I don't have an issue with it at all. But for me, I think if it's about making change, then you have to see yourself as a facilitator of other people saying, talking, naming their world, and you facilitate them, because in most cases they're probably powerless. So, thank you.
Thanks.